So before we get started with today's video, I have a special announcement to make. Now, I've talked about this before, I've even made a couple of community posts about it, so I apologize if I'm sounding really annoying at this point, but for those of you that maybe didn't catch that, the History of Carnosaur has finally been released. For those of you that don't know, this book is by my friend Joey Palinkis. He has been working on this book for a very long time. I first announced this book back, I think, in October of 2023 when I did my own Carnosaur retrospective video. So if you're interested in the history of Carnosaur, you know, this really weird, obscure film franchise from the 90s, definitely check this book out. I'll leave the link to the Amazon page down in the description below if you guys want to check it out. You know, it has information in it that you just don't see anywhere else about the Carnosaur franchise. And if I can find it, what's really cool about it is even I have a writing part in the book. Look how cool that is. I feature in the book. That's so cool. Honestly, I want to take this time to just thank Joey so much for allowing me to have a writing part in this book. It's so cool to finally have a physical form of media that talks about the history of Carnosaur. It pretty much compiles everything that I talked about in my video, along with even more stuff, because Joey did a lot of exclusive interviews with producers and actors and some of the special effects workers. Seriously, he has exclusive interviews from people like Adam Simon and Scott Woodard and Louis Morneau and Ted Haynes and Scott Valentine. Seriously, just a wide range of people. So if you want to know more about this franchise, along with exclusive information and behind-the-scenes stories and developments and whatnot, along with some exclusive pictures too, I definitely recommend getting this book. But thank you for your time. I think that's pretty much it for this part. So without further ado, let's continue with the video. Over the decades, dinosaurs have roamed media in one way or another. Whether they're fighting giant apes in film, or whether you're hunting them in video games, or whether you're discovering an island full of them in books, dinosaurs have continued to exist in our world thanks to these many outlets that allow us to keep their essence alive. That being said, despite the sheer amount of dinosaurs that have been discovered over the last 200 years, some are used more abundantly than others. Most people would likely assume that dinosaur to be the Tyrannosaurus Rex, but the king of the dinosaurs wasn't the only one to have a rich history in media. The dinosaur I often think about in this regard are sauropods. For those of you that don't know, I absolutely love sauropods. They're just so unique and almost alien to this world, yet they existed at one point. These long-necked behemoths that have been interpreted and depicted in so many forms over the last 200 years. For today's video, I wanted to do something special. In case you didn't know, June 27th is when I uploaded my first video on YouTube, and this year marks my 8th year on this platform. So I decided that I wanted to take this month to cover my favorite dinosaur group the best way I know how, by going through its many depictions in media over the years. Looking back on it, sauropods have been used in a variety of roles in dinosaur films, video games, literature, and so on. They've come in many different shapes and sizes, they've been brought to life through the use of many artistic techniques, and to this day, they continue to astonish both people of science and the general public alike. The history of sauropods in media is rich, but let's start at the very beginning when sauropods were first discovered. The first sauropod fossil remains were discovered in 1825, at least according to Manospondylus' blog article on the history of Diplodocus Reconstructions. According to his text, the first remains were uncovered by Georges Cuvier, a French naturalist and paleontologist, but he initially thought that they belonged to a whale. More remains were found several years later in 1841 by Sir Richard Owens, the very man who would put a name to these ancient saurians, and around the same point in time no less. Owens would coin the term dinosaur sometime in the early 1840s, but specifically in 1841, he discovered the Cetiosaurus and the Cardiodon in England. Because the remains were pretty fragmentary, there was a lack of any real visual recreation. However, with the given remains, Owens' first thought was that these animals were aquatic, reptilian, and carnivorous. At the time, he was only working with a few remains, one of them being a caudal vertebrae, which he compared to a whale likely because of the size. No doubt this would also be where he would get the name Cetiosaurus because it literally means whale lizard. At this point in time, the iconic look of the long-necked dinosaur didn't exist yet, and it wouldn't until scientists would get their hands on more remains little by little. As the 1950s, 60s, and 70s went by, more and more remains would be discovered, but nothing to really indicate the distinctive long necks that sauropods would eventually become known for. According to an article written by paleontologist and paleoartist Mark Witton on his blog site, there was a book titled Geology of Oxford and the Valley of the Thames written by geologist John Phillips, who provides a drawing recreation and labels of more bone material of Cetiosaurus found in Oxfordshire, UK. A true sauropod reconstruction wouldn't appear until the late 1870s, around the start of a point in time best known as the Bone Wars, an era in which a rivalry between two well-known paleontologists, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, would lead to years of aggressive fossil hunting from both parties, which in turn led to the discovery of several more dinosaurs, including a couple of sauropods like Camarasaurus and Diplodocus in 1877. Finally, a few skeleton reconstructions had been made, the earliest one being of the Camarasaurus by zoologist John A. Ryder, which indicates that scientists were still not fully aware of sauropod's most distinctive feature. However, as time went on and more remains were found, especially during this heated climate of aggressive fossil hunting, more reconstructions were published of other sauropod specimens, like Othniel Marsh's reconstruction of the Brontosaurus from 1883, which had been discovered in 1874. Finally, scientists were beginning to learn about these animals' long necks, and as a result, more and more depictions were created. For example, you have J. Blanadette's Atlantosaurus art from 1886, Carl Dahlgren's Amphicoelius art, and Joseph Smith's Brontosaurus art, both of which are from 1892. You have Charles R. Knight's Brontosaurus in the water painting from 1897, and in the same year, he would also make an art piece for Cope's Amphicoelius sketch, and so on. With all this news of giant lizards being discovered, you can only imagine what the general public was thinking. These immense creatures probably sounded unbelievable, maybe even terrifying to them. But where these ancient animals left the general public possibly unsettled, it left writers of fiction to think of the endless possibilities for them. Despite some scientists describing sauropods as herbivorous dinosaurs, there were a few pieces of literature that used these giants to instead depict them as carnivores. Take, for example, Frank Seville's Beyond the Great South Wall from 1899, a story about an expedition into the South Pole where our characters encounter a bloodthirsty Brontosaurus that's worshipped by the Mayans. Or Eden Philpott's 1901 short story titled A Story Without an End that featured in his anthology book Fancy Free, which tells a repeating story throughout time where various organisms ponder their existence, wondering if evolution has more in store for life and doubtful that they are the best it has to offer. In one section of the story, a pair of Brontosaurs debating on the topic are forced to retreat from the area as a hungry Atlantosaurus stalks them from afar. And then of course, there's 1908's The Last Haunt of the Dinosaur, featuring a pair of English hunters traveling to the southern regions of Africa where they come across a bloodthirsty dinosaur resembling that of a carnivorous sauropod. This would also be one of the earliest examples of a long-necked beast inhabiting the jungles of Africa, a description that's often associated with the Mokele Mbembe myth that's been used a few times in pop culture, which you'll see as we progress through the video. The Mokele Mbembe holds several characteristics similar to sauropods and is often depicted as such, though some reports have allegedly described the mysterious animal to possess a horn, a feature not commonly seen in sauropods, at least not in this point in time. Regardless, the reports, coverage, and stories behind this creature no doubt contributed to the trope of deadly carnivorous sauropods. Eventually, sauropods would mellow out in different formats of literature, like cartoonist Winsor McKay's silly cartoon from 1905 depicting a Brontosaurus skeleton participating in a horse race from his comic strip, Dream of the Rarebit Fiend. And later on, in 1913, he would make another silly cartoon illustration in his well-known strip, Little Nemo in Slumberland, where the characters visit the land of the antediluvians and encounter a mischievous Brontosaurus. Then there was the display of Dippy the Diplodocus. Back in 1898, railroad workers from Wyoming stumbled upon the fossilized remains of a giant animal. This giant animal, of course, was Diplodocus. The find would make the news and capture the attention of philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, who saw it as an opportunity to secure the dinosaur as a new attraction for his Pittsburgh museum. He would finance an expedition to search for their own Diplodocus skeleton, and eventually they would find one. Despite being incomplete, paleontologists at the time used other sauropods as references to reconstruct their newest find as well as possible. The original skeleton, to this day, is on display at the Pittsburgh Carnegie Museum. However, the story goes that in 1902, King Edward VII, who was friends with Carnegie, visited him at his Scottish home, and he noticed the drawing of the Diplodocus skeleton that was created after the dinosaur's discovery hanging on his wall. Carnegie would bring him up to date on the discovery, and King Edward was so impressed by it all, he wanted London to have its own species on display. So initial plans were to try and find another Diplodocus skeleton, but the director of Carnegie's Pittsburgh Museum suggested they display a life-size replica of the skeleton they already had instead. And so they did, and the dinosaur skeleton replica was given the nickname Dippy. Dippy became pretty popular amongst dinosaur fanatics of the time, because other museums from different regions would request replicas of the skeleton as well, including Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Bologna, St. Petersburg, Madrid, and La Plata. Dippy would essentially become a celebrity during this point in time, as the dinosaur itself, and Diplodocus as a whole, would be featured in an array of media, from news outlets to cartoons, to art, to even a couple of short stories that have some of the weirdest Diplodocus depictions I have ever heard of. One of these stories is simply called The Diplodocus, written by playwright Porter Emerson Brown in 1908, and was a humorous story about a mad scientist who crossbred different animal species together in the hopes of selling his creations for profit. Once he hears about the discovery of the Diplodocus, however, he attempts to recreate the giant dinosaur by crossbreeding several modern animal species together, including elephant, rhinoceros, hippopotamus, kangaroo, emu, and so on. What results is a creature that sounds absolutely nothing like a Diplodocus. While there's no actual artist recreation of the creature in the original story's print, the story would get re-released in a book titled The Mammoth Book of Awesome Comic Fantasy, and features the Diplodocus in the front and back cover, revealing it to look like a very exaggerated fictional hybrid animal for the comedy of the story. Another short story called The Chase of the Diplodocus by Harry Allen was published in the Red Book magazine in 1912, and it's about a group of people that travel to the Florida Everglades after hearing word that a dinosaur behemoth, the Diplodocus, still roams that area. They track it down but fail to capture the creature, which, like the Diplodocus from 1908, is shown to be a much more exaggerated version of the actual animal. In fact, it looks more dragon-like than dinosaur-like, but despite the goofy look to it in this drawing recreation, the animal is depicted to be much more hostile in the story, as it's guessed to be a female protecting her nest. Regardless, these early stories gave a much more wacky and whimsical look to the dinosaur that hardly displays any elements that makes a sauropod what it is. But there's some charm in these older views of pulpy antediluvian saurians that were featured primarily in stories and in art. But things during this point in time had changed drastically for the world of dinosaurs. No longer were they only going to be depicted in just art and literature, because by the turn of the century, a new medium had created a completely new market of entertainment. As a result, dinosaurs, and by extension sauropods specifically, were going to be depicted in a completely different fashion, all with the magic of the moving picture. The early 1900s marked the earliest examples of dinosaurs in film, with Brontosaurus being the star in several of them, like the famous Gertie the Dinosaur short from 1914 made by the aforementioned Winsor McCay. Gertie was McKay's third entry in his line of animated films. The first two focused on characters that featured in his previous comic strips. But McKay was looking to push the boundaries of animation with his next film, and what greater challenge is there than to bring a dinosaur to life? After 2 years of work drawing out thousands of frames of backgrounds and dinosaurs, Gertie the Dinosaur was born, and was an absolute sensation. So much so, a knockoff film was made just the following year in 1915 by John R. Bray, another animator who instead used his knowledge to cut corners in the animation market for the sake of industrializing cartoons and their development. He even went as far as to steal a lot of McKay's techniques and ideas to patent them off as his own, which he would later attempt to use in his own work. What resulted was a film called Diplodocus, featuring a sauropod character who does everything that Gertie did, but, you know, cheaper and with less heart. Gertie is actually a good representation for how sauropods were depicted in dinosaur films of the silent era. Gertie was, and still is, a lovable, friendly, good-natured goofball, a trait that would be common in sauropods in other films during this time, despite not being as character-based as Gertie. In a time where special effects were still finding its footing in the film industry, some people had to get creative with bringing the past to life, like stop-motion animator Willis O'Brien, who used articulated models to make his Brontosaurus move and even breathe. In his films like The Dinosaur and the Missing Link from 1915, Prehistoric Poultry from 1916, and RFD 10,000 BC from 1917, the Brontosaurs were mainly used for comedic purposes, either partaking in some of the slapstick itself, and/or being used more as a pet or domesticated animal. This is also evident with movies like The First Circus from 1921 and Three Ages from 1923. As we progress through the decades, you'll see that this goofy or gentle giant demeanor would be the norm for most sauropod depictions in media. Not just in film, but also cartoons, like Felix the Cat Trifles with Time from 1925, Daffy Duck and the Dinosaur from 1939,
Well, now isn't that clever?
and of course, who could forget the Flintstones from 1960? But going back to the 1910s, there was a bit of discourse with the paleontology community regarding how some sauropods looked, which in turn sparked some interesting depictions of these long-necked reptiles. Some scientists had disagreed with the notion that sauropods were able to support their weight enough to stand on straight legs. That, and in the case of American zoologist Oliver Hay, it was thought that because dinosaurs were reptilian, crocodiles were a better reference for their build. As a result, Hay would publish a paper, initially in 1908 by itself, but later in 1910 it was accompanied by a pencil drawing of a Diplodocus standing on sprawled legs like a lizard. This strange trend of sprawl-legged sauropod reconstructions would eventually lead to more art recreations of it, including the infamous Heinrich Harder painting from 1916. However, the theory didn't hold up. I guess you could say it didn't have a leg to stand on. While we're on the topic of paleontology, sauropods would make an appearance in some of the earliest examples of dinosaur documentaries. More specifically, a Brontosaurus was featured in an educational short called 50 Million Years Ago from 1925, which gives it its familiar straight-legged stance again. By the mid-1920s, however, the friendly face we were so used to seeing in sauropods would eventually start to dissipate, as many of them were depicted as more aggressive and even possibly carnivorous in pop culture, likely a reference to their initial depictions as bloodthirsty aquatic animals when they were first discovered. Movies like 1925's The Lost World featured Brontosaurus going toe-to-toe, or claw-to-claw if you will, with the Tyrannosaurus rex, along with the dinosaur later rampaging through the streets of London terrorizing the locals. The following year, in 1926, a knockoff film was made called The Lost World, which was, funnily enough, also made by John Bray's company. It was very much a comedy film, but still depicted a brontosaur fighting and even winning a battle against a T-Rex. Later on in 1933, one of the most famous monster movies in the world would make its debut, King Kong, which featured an aquatic brontosaur attacking the group of sailors on Skull Island, snatching them up within its jaws while wading in the water, and even chasing one up a tree before also picking him off. The 1930s, 40s, and 50s were also ripe with pulp science fiction comics and short stories that sometimes portrayed sauropods as monstrous threats. But with science continuing to advance and the look of sauropod dinosaurs changing, the 30s and 40s would offer a variety of depictions. On the science front, a very weird and infamous skull reconstruction was made for a Brontosaurus specimen in 1931 at the Yale Peabody Museum in Connecticut. Othniel Marsh had been reconstructing the Brontosaurus skeleton in the 1890s, but because he didn't have a skull to work with, he used two other sauropod dinosaur skulls as references, more specifically Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, to recreate a Brontosaurus skull. He came up with this, and several years later, a very weird sculpture was made to be put on display. A couple of years later, the Sinclair Oil Company would go on a marketing campaign at the Chicago World's Fair in 1933 by using life-size models of dinosaurs in exhibits to attract people to their business. Of course, this included a massive full-scale model of the company's main dinosaur mascot, the Brontosaurus, which is still synonymous with their logo to this day. Along with that, in the early 1900s, the aquatic sauropod theory had merged into a slightly different version of that theory, in that sauropods were semi-terrestrial, spending most of their lives in water because they couldn't support their own weight on land, and they needed the water to help suspend some of that load off. This would launch a trend in various pieces of media over the decades that exemplified this theory. This depiction of sauropods is seemingly endless in art. Some notable examples date as early as the late 1800s, like Charles R. Knight's Brontosaurus in the Swamp painting from 1897. You also have Zdenek Burian's snorkeling Brachiosaurus art from 1941, and Rudolf Zallinger's Age of Reptiles mural from 1947. Of course, there's plenty more, but these are some of the most well-known examples. A lot of these examples, especially the ones I just showed you, are very present in literature. There was 1941's Animals of Yesterday, 1953's All About Dinosaurs, 1955's The True Book of Dinosaurs, 1966's Dinosaurs and Other Prehistoric Reptiles, 1971's Dinosaurs, The Start Right Elf Book, and 1972's Album of Dinosaurs, just to name a few. In fictional literature, you have several covers, art, and imagery that represent sauropods as swamp-dwelling airheads as well. One good example of this is sci-fi author Brian Aldiss's short story Poor Little Warrior from 1958, which is about a hunter who travels back in time to hunt a Brontosaurus and succeeds, as the lumbering swamp-dwelling lizard does very little to prevent its own death. But the Brontosaurus, depicted with oversized parasites crawling on its thick skin, indirectly gets revenge when one of those parasites kill the hunter shortly after. Comics are also a hotspot for this aquatic trait in sauropods, like the first ever issue of Turok Son of Stone from Dell Comics in 1954, which not only features the Brontosaurus in water, but also hilariously shows it flinging a Dimetrodon around after it accidentally bit down on its tail while chasing after our characters. Other examples include This Curious World from 1934, Mickey Mouse's Land of Long Ago from 1940, the 15th issue of The World Around Us Prehistoric Animals from 1958, several instances in the Young Earth comics from 1960, Sergeant Rock's Giant Battle Tales from 1965, the Valley of the Dinosaurs comic from 1975, Tor also from 1975, there's plenty of examples from Tarzan like this panel from 1977, The Thing and Skull the Slayer, the Cartoon History of the Universe comic, and Devil Dinosaur, all from 1978, and so on. In film, there's 1933's King Kong, as mentioned earlier, Disney's Fantasia from 1940, which marked the first film featuring dinosaurs brought to life with both the use of Technicolor and 2D animation together, and even in documentaries like The Animal World from 1956.
Engineered by nature in a freakish manner, so that she was hardly able to support her massive weight on land, this huge monster spent most of her time wading in the waters of the world and came up on the land only to seek food or lay eggs.
I guess you could say this theory didn't hold water. As far as film went, the roles of sauropods would vary. In some cases, they'd be nothing more than background dinosaurs, just there to accentuate the prehistoric setting or events of certain films, resulting in little to no real screen time. One of the earliest examples of this is seen in The Ghost of Slumber Mountain from 1918. But this would be more frequent in later films like 1933's Son of Kong, 1948's Unknown Island, 1966's 1 Million million years BC, and 1977's Planet of Dinosaurs are good examples of these. Regardless, most of them were brought to life with impressive stop-motion animation, with the Brontosaur from The Ghost of Slumber Mountain animated by Willis O'Brien, the model for the Brontosaur in Son of Kong made by Marcel Delgado and animated by E.B. Gibson, the Brontosaur model in Unknown Island made by Ellis Berman, the Brontosaur from 1 million years BC being animated by Ray Harryhausen, and the Brontosaur from Planet of Dinosaurs being animated by Steven Zerkis and Jim Opperol. Regarding 1 million years BC, there was actually a planned Brontosaurus versus caveman sequence that was to play out as the film's final climactic battle. But according to Ray Harryhausen, they had to make a last-minute change on that scene due to budget restrictions, missing another opportunity to feature a Brontosaurus in a bigger role being portrayed as a savage and deadly force. But luckily, sauropods would play a much bigger role in future films, and in some cases even be one of the main stars. Movies like 1951's Lost Continent is a good example of this, which, funnily enough, the movie doesn't feature any theropod dinosaurs and instead has a very hostile Brontosaurus attacking a group of military personnel on a mission to locate a lost atomic rocket. 1960's Dinosaurus has more of a friendly Brontosaur, who plays more of a gentle giant role, even giving rides to some of our characters and fighting against the bloodthirsty Tyrannosaurus Rex. The two prehistoric beasts were initially found frozen by a Caribbean island but were awoken after being struck by lightning. The gentle giant role was not at all unfamiliar for Brontosaurus, and by this point was a staple to most sauropod depictions in not just film, but also cartoons, TV shows, and documentaries. Sure, there were still a few examples here and there of sauropods being a deadly force, and even in some cases antagonistic, depending on where it's being featured, but as time went on, these examples would be few and far between, at least in comparison to the much more amicable, even companionable view of sauropods. As a result, they would be depicted in a more cartoony style, like the Sinclair's Dino mascot balloon in the 1963 Macy's Thanksgiving Parade, and Bronte from the 1966 animated cartoon show Dino Boy in the Lost Valley, and the stop-motion animated Dopey from 1974's Land of the Lost, and the Brontosaur mother and her young from the 1977 Tsuburaya-produced Japanese show Dinosaur Expedition Born Free. Even in more educational formats, sauropods like Brontosaurus were depicted as harmless, like in the 1976 documentary Dinosaurs the Terrible Lizards.
He was a harmless animal. He only ate plants.
And while we're on the topic of the more educational side of things, paleontology is the gift that keeps on giving when it comes to weird sauropod theories. Because in 1975, a paper by paleontologist Walter Coombs would be published called Sauropod Habits and Habitats, and it suggested the possibility of certain sauropods, specifically Diplodocus, possessing a proboscis, aka a trunk. The idea was that the skull structure of the Diplodocus was somewhat similar to that of an elephant, i.e. its narial opening, which is often associated with animals that have trunks. The idea would go on to start a short trend of trunk sauropod depictions that appeared in many different literary works, like the Dicryosaurus in the 1975 book All New Dinosaurs and Their Friends. The concept was also referenced in paleontologist Robert Bacher's influential 1986 book The Dinosaur Heresies. The following year, another book titled Dinosaurs, the 1987 Childcraft Annual features an Apatosaurus with a trunk grabbing at some vegetation. And the year after that, in 1988, the concept would be showcased again in Dougal Dixon's speculative fiction book The New Dinosaurs, An Alternate History. More specifically, the adaptation shows up in the fictional future sauropod species called the lumber, or the Elaphosaurus giganteus. The depiction would even be taken as far as the field of cryptozoology. In a 1994 Czech book titled something to the effect of Following Mysterious Footsteps, which serves as a document of mysterious animals of myths and legends, the African cryptid mentioned earlier, Mokele Mbembe, is featured and is depicted here possessing a trunk. As interesting as it was, not much came from the idea, as it didn't make sense from an anatomical or evolutionary standpoint. The muscles needed for trunks to properly function is a characteristic mainly seen in mammals and not so much in reptiles, and even if it was seen in reptiles, it wouldn't make sense for a sauropod to have it, considering trunks are the evolutionary traits used to obtain hard-to-reach food, and sauropods already have their evolutionary trait for that, their long necks. This all gets revisited later on in a 2006 paper called Paleoneurological Evidence Against a Proboscis in the Sauropod Dinosaur Diplodocus, written by Fabian Knoll, Peter M. Galton, and Raquel Lopez Antonianzes. Regardless of the logic, it's still a fun thought experiment. It was also during this point in time dinosaurs in general were going through a transitional period in how they were being viewed, an era best known as the Dinosaur Renaissance, which initially started in the 60s and would continue all the way through the 80s. In the context of sauropods, they were beginning to be seen less as dumb lumbering lizards bound to the limits of swamps for the majority of their lives, and more as animals with complex social behaviors and terrestrial active lifestyles. Because of this transitional period, the 80s was a hotspot for a variety of sauropod depictions in media. While dinosaur films at this point in time were taking a back seat with a few exceptions here and there were other areas of media that were beginning to rise in popularity, animated cartoon shows for example, a lot of which featured dinosaurs and by extension sauropods. Given the sheer amount of shows that were released within this decade, there were a variety of art styles and aesthetics being worked on, which also meant more room to explore a variety of depictions of sauropods, since for a while they had primarily kept that friendly, gentle giant demeanor in pop culture. In a case like Hanna-Barbera's 1978 Godzilla show, it was the complete opposite, with the episode The Time Dragons featuring an aggressive and predatory Diplodocus that fights against the Big G himself. Or in the 1984 show The Transformers, which introduced us to the rebellious Brontosaur Dinobot named Sludge. But some shows opted to keep the friendlier versions of sauropods, like the 1986 Ghostbusters show in their episode Dynamite Dinosaurs, featuring a caring mother Brontosaurus with her young. And of course, there's the goofy, more cartoony Bronto from the 1986 Flintstones spin-off show The Flintstones Kids. 1987's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles introduced their own version of Dippy the Diplodocus, forming a quick friendship with the harmless dinosaur.
This is great! Nobody's gonna mess with us while we're on Dippy's back!
Dippy?
Yeah, Dippy the Diplodocus.
And then there's the friendly characters from 1989's Dink the Little Dinosaur. The 80s also had some weirder, more experimental depictions of sauropods, like the anthropomorphic alien Brachiosaurs from 1987's Dinosaurs. In a more badass case, there was the giant armored Brontosaurus from 1988's Dino Riders, who had an entire episode dedicated to it, because it was essentially a marketing tactic to promote the show's biggest dinosaur playset in their toy line, which was being sold in tandem to the show's release. It wasn't an uncommon method for 80s cartoon shows to be used as marketing campaigns and essentially commercials to promote toys and products of the action figures and playsets they were based on. Other examples of this are Sludge from the Transformers and Gigantosaur from He-Man, though I don't think this creature ever appeared in the show. And when sauropods weren't being used in kids' cartoons, they found roles in other areas of TV, like 1985's Dinosaur being brought to life with stop motion done by the talented Phil Tippett. While dinosaur films weren't exactly prominent in the 80s, there were a couple of notable examples that even used Brontosaurus as their main star, like 1985's Baby Secret of the Lost Legend, which is about the discovery of a small family of Brontosaurus found in the deep jungles of the Congo. It's also one of the few dinosaur cryptid movies, as this one utilizes the Mokele-Mbembe legend for their sauropods. While we're on the topic of Mokele, the sauropod cryptid had been used a lot in media, making many appearances in cryptozoology books, art, comics, and documentaries over the years. It would even be referenced as a kaiju in the MonsterVerse Godzilla franchise from 2014. That said, not every depiction of this creature has been sauropods. In 1954, Jungle Comics featured a story called Jackal Man, in which an ivory hunter visits the African jungles of the Congo and encounters this serpent dinosaur creature that doesn't really look like a sauropod, yet is referenced to be Mokele-Mbembe. In a more recent example, the 2012 found footage movie, The Dinosaur Project, features a group of people escorting a cryptozoologist who travels to the Congo in search of the Mokele-Mbembe, which in this movie is depicted as an elasmosaur instead of a sauropod for some reason. Getting back on topic, a more influential film would be released a few years later in 1988, Don Bluth's The Land Before Time. which features a group of young dinosaur characters including Littlefoot the Brontosaurus, who travel across a desolate region to reunite with their families. On top of Littlefoot's more cutesy, childlike design, the movie also features more serious portrayals of sauropods, which were very much inspired by the retrosaurs that you see in classic dinosaur art. Not since 1940s Fantasia, almost 50 years earlier, had dinosaurs been portrayed in 2D animation to this degree, and to this day, it's still appreciated by both children and adults alike. But the love of sauropods spread far and wide, not just with their on-screen appearances, but with their off-screen ones as well. This ranged from the more simple designs of children's books, like my personal favorite from my own childhood, Patrick's Dinosaurs from 1983, to much weirder depictions of speculative science books, like the previously mentioned New Dinosaurs book from 1988 by Dougal Dixon. The book is an exploration into a hypothetical world where dinosaurs never went extinct and continue to evolve. In the case of the sauropods, we get a few different species, a couple of them being more grounded designs, like the dwarf Titanosaurus and the Rajaphant, and others being more extreme, like the trunked lumber I mentioned before, and the armored Eutitanosaur Turdosaurus. There were also comics, my favorite of which being Calvin and Hobbes from 1985, which focused on the wild imaginary adventures of a 6-year-old boy and his stuffed tiger, some of them involving long-necked giants like Diplodocus and Brontosaurus. What was cool is that Bill Watterson would sometimes give his sauropods a more retro look, and other times he would follow the current view of science and depict them as more accurate for their time. There were also trading cards like the dark comedy Gorefest that was Dinosaurs Attack from 1988, which featured plenty of examples of sauropods being violent towards people. Even plenty of exhibits featured sauropod dinosaur animatronics, like from the once popular but now defunct Dynamation Company. While the 80s certainly had a fair bit of variety and abundance when it came to dinosaur media as a whole, and by extension, multiple sauropod depictions, the 90s would prove to be the biggest example of dinomania the public had ever seen. As a result, sauropods played many roles and came in many different variants, mediums, shapes, and sizes. In the case of the most famous dinosaur movie in the world, and the one that would launch the 90s dinosaur craze, 1993's Jurassic Park, the Brachiosaur's role was minor yet effective, being used to introduce both the characters and the audience to the genetically engineered dinosaurs of Isla Nublar. Sauropods have been used for this purpose before, an introductory to dinosaurs as a way to offer a sense of scale, wonder, and in some cases, even apprehension. And it's understandable why sauropods are often picked for this role. When you want to show off just how grandiose dinosaurs are as a whole, it would make sense to pick the biggest and most unique one. And obviously it's mentioned every time, but Jurassic Park also brought dinosaurs to life with both practical effects and CGI, not only bringing sauropods to life in a whole new way, but it's also what future on-screen dinosaur media would use heavily later on, including Jurassic Park's 2 sequels, 1997's The Lost World Jurassic Park, which has a scene featuring a motorcyclist riding under a Mamenchisaurus, and 2001's Jurassic Park 3, which features my personal favorite Brachiosaurus iteration in the whole franchise. While more realistic than most Hollywood depictions, Jurassic Park's use of its sauropod dinosaur shows that media during this point in time were still very much maintaining the gentle giant trope that's often associated with them. This is further evident with other movies like 1993's Prehysteria, which would introduce a friendly pygmy brachiosaurus named Paula after the famous pop singer Paula Abdul. Then there's the 1991 remake of the Land of the Lost TV show that features harmless brontosaurs that are in and out of the show. In some cases, sauropods were given goofier, cartoony looks, mainly to fit the kid-friendly aesthetic of works like 1991's Dinosaur, with the Brontosaurus character Monica de Vertebrae, or the Apatosaurus from 1990's Stanley and the Dinosaur short. Friendly sauropods would be very present in books as well, including James Gurney's Dinotopia books, like his famous dinosaur parade image that featured in the first book, Dinotopia, A Land Apart from Time, in 1992. Sometimes they'd even be donned in armor when they were to cross into the more dangerous carnivore-heavy regions of the island, like the ones depicted in his second book, Dinotopia, The World Beneath, from 1995. Gurney would even feature a firefighting Brachiosaurus in his 4th installment of the original Dinotopia series, Journey to Shandara, in 2007. Other books like 1990's Dinosaur Dream and 1994's The Magic School Bus in the Time of the Dinosaurs are also examples of this. But sauropods were not always pleasant, especially in more action-based mediums where the dinosaurs are seen as mainly enemies than allies, like video games for instance. Games like 1989's Prehistoric Isle, 1991's Joe and Mac, and 1994's Jurassic Park arcade game features them as dangerous threats to the player. While we're on the topic of dinosaur video games, other games like 1997's The Lost World Jurassic Park and 1999's Carnivores 2 uses sauropods more as background dinosaurs that have little to no interactions with players. But with the popularity of dinosaurs in mainstream pop culture during this point in time, many people, especially scientists, saw this as the perfect opportunity to push out more educational dinosaur content to a wider demographic of people. As a result, we would see sauropods portrayed in much more informative scenes, like the Astrodon from Robert Bacher's 1995 xenofiction novel Raptor Red, and Apatosaurus in 3D Dinosaur Adventure, an interactive game from 1993, and even the Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus from the most successful and one of the most well-known dinosaur documentaries in the world, 1999's Walking with Dinosaurs, with special effects inspired by the likes of Jurassic Park. In the dinosaur anthology, we follow a coming-of-age story of a female baby Diplodocus growing up in the late Jurassic region of what is now the state of Colorado. The models would continue to be used in future installments of the series, and even features in BBC's 2001 Lost World movie adaptation. The use of stop motion in general was already facing a decline well before this point, but movies like the adult-oriented Dinosaur Island from 1994 and Dinosaur Babes from 1996 were among the few left at this time that featured sauropods with this technique. The popularity of Walking with Dinosaurs, coupled with the rise of computer-generated special effects that was less time-consuming to produce, along with the fact that a lot of new information about dinosaurs in all aspects of their lives had been discovered, led to a huge wave of dinosaur documentaries that would feature all throughout the 2000s to varying quality. As you can imagine, plenty of these featured all kinds of sauropods in all kinds of situations. 2000's The Ballad of Big Al featured a standoff between Diplodocus against a pack of allosaurs. 2001's When Dinosaurs Roamed America featured Camarasaurus and Apatosaurus wandering through a dry Jurassic season in Utah. 2002's Chased by Dinosaurs features Nigel Marven venturing back to the Cretaceous period to document a herd of Argentinosaurs, one of the largest dinosaurs to ever exist. 2003's Dinosaur Planet features Titanosaurs, more specifically Saltosaurus from Alpha's Egg, and Magyarosaurus from Pod's Travels. 2006's Prehistoric Park brings Nigel Marven back to continue his ventures traveling back in time, where he takes the opportunity to rescue a herd of Titanosaurs in one episode. 2007's Dinosaurs Giants of Patagonia focuses entirely on, you guessed it, what life was like in early Cretaceous Patagonia of South America, as the region held two behemoths that were and still are of great interest in science, the Giganotosaurus and the Argentinosaurus. 2007's Dino Death Traps takes us to western China in the late Jurassic period, where we see Mamenchisaurus grazing on the treetops. 2008's Jurassic Fight Club shows the defense moves of Camarasaurus as it fights for its life against a pair of allosaurs. 2009's Monsters Resurrected features a Paralititan herd being targeted and fought over by Rugops and Spinosaurus. 2010's Last Days of the Dinosaurs features a massive herd of Alamosaurus facing the KT extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs. 2011's Dinosaur Revolution gave us many types of sauropods, including Lusotitan, Cedurosaurus, Dinetosaurus, Mamenchisaurus, and Rapetosaurus. But the funniest depiction of sauropods in this show has to be the scene where the Shunosaurus ate the mushrooms and started hallucinating. Okay, I think you guys get the idea of the sheer amount of sauropods featured in dinosaur documentaries during this point in time. Unfortunately, their use in a lot of these docs boiled down to them being prey to the larger carnivorous dinosaurs. I mean, it makes sense if you were trying to hype up carnivores, which are the more popular types of dinosaurs. If you want to make them look really strong and badass, one of the best ways to do that is pitting them up against the largest of the dinosaurs and winning against them. Sure, it wasn't always the case, and it's not like this trope hasn't been used before in both fiction and science, but it was pretty frequent, particularly during this era of dinosaur documentaries. Regardless, as science continued, sauropods would be used more fairly as the years went by. That being said, there were still some weird claims being made about them in recent times. One example was when 2009's Clash of the Dinosaurs suggested the controversial idea that sauropods like Sauroposeidon were so massive and tall, they required a second brain at the hip to function the lower parts of their bodies, which was posited by paleontologist Matthew Witton in the doc itself. However, this wasn't true at all. Turns out, the interview that they had with Witton in the documentary was quote-mined and edited in a way where he made it seem like the idea of a second brain could have been legitimate. But according to a post on Witton's blog site titled Lies, Damned Lies, and Clash of the Dinosaurs, Witton was only referencing an outdated dinosaur theory regarding the sacro-lumbar expansion, which was the swelling within their pelvis region that the show claimed served as a second brain. When Witton told them the truth about this idea, that made the showrunners upset because they thought the idea of a second brain was far more interesting. They wanted to bring up the second brain because it's so entrenched in the popular consciousness, i.e. bad dinosaur books. But they were unhappy that the real explanation turned out to be so unsatisfying. In the end, we did discuss it briefly on camera. I said something like, there was this old idea that the sacral expansion functioned as a second brain to control the hind limbs and the tail. But in fact, it almost certainly contained a glycogen body like the sacral expansions of birds. Trouble is, nobody knows exactly what glycogen bodies of birds do. Somebody in the editing room neatly sidestepped the mystery of the glycogen body by cutting that bit down. So what I am shown saying in the program is this: the sacral expansion functioned as a second brain to control the hind limbs and tail. So yeah, as interesting as the second brain idea is, it was nothing more than misinformation being spread by people who clearly didn't respect science. Unsurprisingly, sauropods also featured in several pieces of sci-fi media as well. During this point in time, dinosaur movies had taken a bit of a backseat again, but we still got to see some depictions of sauropods in film, like Baleen, the elderly but strong Brachiosaurus from 2000's Dinosaur made by Disney. Only a handful of times have sauropods been depicted with a vibrant personality to this degree, at least as far as dinosaur films went. And on top of that, Baleen is one of the ones that specifically captures the spirit of age and wisdom that feels so natural for behemoths like sauropods to have. According to the text from Dinosaur: The Evolution of an Animated Feature, supervising animator Mike Belzer describes Baleen as a 65-year-old brachiosaur who has seen the world, been around, a matriarch who is the last of her kind. She feels out of place because she's being thrust into a herd and she can't quite keep up with the rest of them. She's one of the misfits in the back. She has a strength, but her reserve and dignity always comes through. Then there was the action-packed Brontosaurus stampede scene from 2005's King Kong, who ran towards our group of characters after being startled by a pack of fictional carnivorous dinosaurs, Venatosaurs. The filmmakers opted to keep the more retro look to them, likely as a homage to the original 1933 film, although in this one they aren't carnivorous anymore, nor are they aquatic. You also have the return of the armored Brachiosaurus of Dinotopia from the 2002 live-action show, the armored and violent Apatosaurus from 2004's Dinosaur King, and the robotic Brachiosaur from 2004's Power Rangers Dino Thunder. The last decade especially had brought dinosaurs back to the public eye thanks mainly to the release of the Jurassic World movies, though their use of sauropods were nowhere close to the same impact as their 90s predecessor. Whereas Jurassic Park used them to establish the awe and wonder of dinosaurs, Jurassic World used them as carnivore fodder, background dinosaurs, and shallow reminders of that awe and wonder. However, the true grandiose essence of sauropods are continued to be kept alive thanks to works like 2022's Prehistoric Planet, which proves to the world that these animals were powerful as shown with the earth-shaking Dreadnoughtus fight, and beautiful as shown with the gentle embrace of the Paluda Titans. Modern speculative science has also given these dinosaurs some weird yet fascinating features. Of course, this is nothing new, as when it comes to dinosaurs, speculation always played a big role in how scientists came to interpret these giants. But the world of speculative biology in itself has led to a range of sauropod designs based on other concepts and ideas. For example, what would sauropods look like had they never gone extinct? I've already mentioned some examples like Dougal Dixon's The New Dinosaurs, but the 2000s have offered its own handful of advanced speculative sauropod species. In the early 2000s, several pieces of art from the planned but never released book, The Speculative Dinosaur Project, features an array of alternative sauropods, and in other cases, sauropod-like dinosaurs, like the Brachioceratopsinae and the Pseudosauropoda groups, which aren't exactly sauropods, but more so other dinosaur groups like ceratopsians and ornithopods that have evolved to fill the niche of sauropods, possessing several of the same elements like their leg and body structure and developing slightly long necks. True sauropods still exist in this world, mainly made up of a variety of titanosaurs that possess their own unique features and characteristics. In 2005, coinciding with the release of King Kong, a book titled The World of Kong, A Natural History of Skull Island, introduced people to the diverse wildlife of Skull Island, many of which didn't make it into the movie. Not only does the book give more explanation to the behaviors and lifestyle of the Brontosaurus featured in the movie, it also introduces another fictional sauropod, Aspergorsis, which sports several spikes that run along its neck down to its back. In 2010, C.M. Kosemen introduced people to his Brontosapien, his version of what an advanced and intelligent sauropod might look like. What he came up with was a big-headed, short-necked creature with a prehensile tongue coordinated enough to complete more specific and smaller-scale tasks. Hell, even Pixar's The Good Dinosaur from 2015 kind of explores this idea of advanced sauropods a bit too, albeit not with the best execution. Given the kid-friendly nature of the film, it stuck with a much more cartoony and rather basic look for its Apatosaurus characters, who are also shown to be living a much more agriculturally advanced lifestyle since it takes place in a world where dinosaurs never went extinct, and they continue to grow more intelligent. And my personal favorite from this bunch has to be Tess Gallagher's Diplodocus art from 2023, depicting it to have this strange crest feature that makes it almost look like an alien. The structure is later explained to be made up of keratin and collagen, with iridescence underneath, and was meant to attract mates. While speculation has given us all sorts of weird designs when it comes to future and/or advanced sauropods, speculation has also served to determine characteristics and traits that sauropods had back in their own time. Take, for example, prehistoric planet's Dreadnoughtus, shown to have 2 rows of balloon-like air sacs that inflate through a series of bellows and are used for display to attract mates or even intimidate rivals. Plenty of artists and scientists have speculated and drawn out different styles, looks, and features regarding what might have been attached to sauropod necks that the fossil record might have failed to preserve. For example, there's the double dewlapped Apatosaurus by Emiliano Troco in 2012, there's Brian Ang's Sauroposeidon with a very massive, exaggerated, but colorful neck inflation display from 2010. Paleontologist Mike Taylor also gives his own interpretation of what an Apatosaurus with neck spikes might look like in a 2015 post to the site that he writes for. And of course, there's plenty examples of experimental sauropod interpretations in fiction as well. In the Dinosaurs vs. Aliens graphic novel from 2012, there are sauropods shown to be donned in tribal-like headwear and accessories, indicating some sort of culture among the dinosaurs that never got a chance to be explored. When 2015's Jurassic World introduced dinosaur hybrid monstrosities into its lore, it opened the floodgates to all sorts of sauropod hybrid creations in their supplementary content, mainly their video games like Jurassic World the Game and Jurassic World Alive on mobile. There's Ankylodocus, which is a cross between Ankylosaurus and Diplodocus, and also features in Jurassic World Evolution. There's Ardontosaurus, which is a cross between the Permian synapsid Secodontosaurus and the Argentinosaurus. There's the Nodapatosaurus, which is a cross between the Ankylosaur Nodosaurus and the sauropod Apatosaurus. And in some cases, the hybrid dinosaurs can be crossed with other dinosaurs to create even weirder hybrid dinosaurs. The Nodapatosaurus can be crossed with Amargasaurus to create the Gigaspikosaurus, or a Giraffatitan to make a Nodapatotitan. You get the idea. 2015 also marked the year where a familiar face makes a return just over 100 years after her debut. While technically not Gertie herself, Winsor McCay had plans to make a dinosaur comic series called Dino that was to star her iconic design. However, this series was cancelled after McCay's untimely death in 1934. For decades, all of the finished portions of the comic had been stuck in storage until years later, with the efforts of historian and author Ulrich Merkel, Dino was able to see the light of day through the media history book Dinomania. TV programs like 2019's Primal took us back to the days of bloodthirsty carnivorous sauropods, albeit in a completely unique way, featuring an Argentinosaurus plagued by some kind of infection that leaves it in this violent, almost zombie-like phase. 2022's Jurassic League comic showcases what a sauropod superhero would look like with the creation of Supersaurus, the Brachiosaurus equivalent of Superman. But the dinosaur superhero craze continues with 2023's Fantastic Four Volume 7 comic that features an Iron Man Brachiosaurus fighting against the titular superhero group. Even the world of science continues to posit more and more weird theories regarding these giants, like the sex lakes theory that was introduced in biologist Brian J. Ford's 2018 book titled Too Big to Walk. The theory states that larger dinosaurs that carried a lot of weight, like sauropods, were unable to mate on land and instead mated in lakes because they needed the buoyancy of the water to support them. And the reason why dinosaurs went extinct was because these sex lakes had begun to dwindle and dry out, making it impossible for these larger dinosaurs to mate and continue their species. This was another one of those ideas that were just not taken very seriously considering the lack of evidence. Not to mention one explanation that I heard from CM Kosemen in one of his videos, where he stated the extinction of dinosaurs correlating with sex lakes would only really apply to the much larger dinosaurs. Yet the fossil record shows that all prehistoric animals, big and small, faced an extinction event, meaning this idea was likely not the case. But going back to the more fictional and experimental works, they bled heavily into more independent projects as well, mainly thanks to the popularity of the internet earlier in the 2010s, as virtual spaces, especially within the last 20 years, have allowed people to express their many ideas and creative processes no matter how outlandish or speculative they might seem. And of course, as you can imagine, as far as the dinosaur side of the internet goes, sauropods were a huge part of this. Sauropods can be seen in YouTube series, it can be seen in art, it can be seen in indie video games, and so on and so forth. Of course, that's not to say they're completely forgotten in the mainstream. Far from it. Sauropods are among the most recognizable dinosaurs to the general public, and even if they don't serve huge roles in some mediums, they've seemingly kept that connotation of being these beautiful giants of the past. This is what the current climate of sauropods looks like. But this begs the question, what does the future look like for them? With how much of an impact they've made in media over the last century and a half specifically, and with how much media has changed in the last 2 decades specifically, I would argue that it's safe to say sauropods will continue to exist in our modern world. In the past 200 years, these animals have continued to amaze us, never truly losing their touch as unique and beautiful giants. And as a result, they continue to interest scientists and the general public alike, whether they appeal to those who like the more fun, comedic, and even cutesy side of them, those who enjoy them as more intense, exaggerated, and violent, those who like them as speculative, mysterious, and strange, and those that prefer them as much more realistic, grounded, and scientifically accurate. If there's anything these dinosaurs have taught us, it's that they're versatile. There's a little bit of everything for everyone, and so long as that's the case, the future of sauropods and media will thrive, and these behemoths will continue to amaze and inspire us for years to come.